Alrighty, so let's talk about how Oregon came to the point of wanting to prioritize action on greenhouse gas reduction in transportation.
Yes. So change at a Department of Transportation is not fast. It takes time. We're big ships, and it takes a while to turn the steering wheel and really start to meaningfully address emissions. And so for the state of Oregon, I think it goes back a couple decades where really our political leadership realized that the climate's starting to change. They wanted to start exploring the issues and see what's really going on. A decade later, about in the 2010s, then they're saying, okay, climate change is real. We should probably start to do something. So in Oregon, we put together our statewide transportation strategy, which was really our decarbonization plan for reducing emissions. And at the time, though, there was still a lot of political resistance. So what we did is write the plan in a if-then. So if we need to reduce emissions, then here are the ways that we do it. But the Department of Transportation, we thought we need to be doing something for it. So we started focusing on things that weren't super politically controversial and to try to gain some trust and momentum and say, it's not so scary. There's some little things that we can do to start to move the needle. So we created a transportation options program, for example, which really benefits people connecting to places anyway. So it's a popular program, but can be effective in reducing emissions. And then now, in 2020, we created the Climate Office, and that was really after we looked at the progress we've made in implementing our statewide strategy. It wasn't so great, not surprisingly. We focused on the low-hanging fruit, so then when we checked in, there was still more that we needed to do. And so the Climate Office was really our concerted effort to say, okay, we're taking this seriously. Things are literally, our forests are burning, it's affecting everybody's daily lives. We need to step up and say, we are part of the problem. Transportation is a big emitter. Let's take some real action. And so that's in earnest, I think, when we really dove in, but it's been a couple decades in the making.
Awesome soundbite. I'm so glad we hooked up. Okay. So how have you incorporated the greenhouse gas emissions into reducing that into the transportation planning process?
Yeah, so there's many ways in which we need to reduce emissions. So part of the Oregon Department of Transportation's Climate Office is really integrating consideration of climate in everything that we do. So if we think about the transportation life cycle, where you have planning, you move into investment, you build projects, you maintain and manage that transportation system, all aspects, we really need to be thinking about emissions. But where are decisions made? And the earlier you can back up in the process, like into the planning side, the better. So I think we recognized that pretty early on. And that's when we developed our statewide transportation strategy to really, within planning, set that policy framework for how we deal with emissions. So we did that back in 2013. And we've been updating our statewide plans and really incorporating that policy framework and making things consistent so that we're very much leaning into that climate space at the highest level policy and down through program implementation.
Because one decision affects the next.
Exactly.
So I've talked to a few people about sustainability and just these types of issues yesterday and today, and one person described it as, back then it was kind of like a feel good, like, oh yeah, we know if we pick paper, it's better than plastic and things like that. But how is your plan and what you're doing quantitative? It's real numbers and real actions. I'm assuming it is.
Yeah, so we have a way that we're looking at the progress that we need to make. And so we have our own targets that we've set for our agency internally to say, how much pricing do we need to have on the transportation system? What does the price level need to be? How broad does it need to be? We also set lines in the sand for where do we need to get to with biking and walking, the proportion of people that do that. And so we have these benchmarks that we're able to evaluate against. And in that way, it makes it real. So instead of some GHG number that just says a certain number of million metric tons, that doesn't relate to people. What we say is we need to quadruple transit service to be effective. We need to double the cost that users pay into the transportation system. So in those ways, we've tried to not only quantify emissions, but make them relatable so that they are implementable.
I think you said pricing.
Mm-hmm.
What did that mean?
So starting to transition into a vehicle mileage a fee instead of the gas tax, looking at tolling and congestion pricing, and
Okay,
really...
yeah, so hold on,
Yeah,
let
go
me get you to state it where you kind of restate.
Okay.
So we're looking at pricing, and that means,
Okay.
if you could kind of say it like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're looking at pricing as an effective tool because it sends a signal to people who drive on the cost and impact of that. And so transitioning to a vehicle miles traveled fee from a gas tax is really effective in making sure that people understand the cost and impact of every single mile driven. And so some of these pricing programs can be really effective in terms of consumer signals.
Awesome. Okay. I think you may have kind of covered this, but I'll say it. Talk about some key changes to your program that have resulted from the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so a few things that we have done in the state of Oregon. As a Department of Transportation, we've created a statewide transportation demand management program. And what that does is it looks at telecommuting as options, it looks at employer programs, and a number of other things that we can do to help move the needle. We've leaned in on the space of intelligent transportation systems and trying to smooth out traffic speeds, because in the short term, while people are still driving gas-powered vehicles, stops and starts have a big emission impact. Another thing that we're doing is transportation electrification. Of course, we got some great funds from the federal government to add charging infrastructure. But in Oregon, we increased that amount, and we've made over a $100 million commitment to adding charging infrastructure in the state. So not only being able to build out a backbone system with some of those federal funds, what we're also doing is a community rebate program so that we can get charging into areas that everyone can access. So multi-unit dwellings, around low-income areas, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and our rural areas.
Okay, first of all, every soundbite is great.
Thank you.
Some people, it's harder than you make it seem, you know.
Thank you.
Okay, so what are some effective methods to communicate these goals to stakeholders in Oregon? How are you getting the word out?
So communicating about climate change has changed over the last couple decades. So it started out by you can't say the word emissions and climate change, to now it's, I think people are seeing the visible signs that the climate is changing and there's extreme weather events. And so tying the real visible impact to now we're taking action is one effective way to communicate about what we're doing, so that we understand the problem, we understand we're part of the problem, and we're taking real and meaningful actions to address that. In general, climate change is a difficult topic to talk about because there's a lot of numbers, information. The problem is so significant that some people are overwhelmed by if we can do anything. But by highlighting some of those incremental steps, those things that we can do to really make a difference, and personalizing it, that's how we can really be effective.
Yeah, I think personalize is definitely key. So I'm sure you ran across a lot of challenges in getting there, right? Can you tell us about some of those?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges in trying to take action is getting the momentum that you need. And so that means sometimes small and incremental steps before you can take the big leap. I think it's being able to effectively articulate the benefits and the challenges that we face and getting that willingness to take action. Let me think about challenges for a sec.
Sometimes, I don't know, sometimes even leadership, depending on the administration, right? I mean,
Yeah.
within the DOT even.
I just leverage them.
Good.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the opportunity is by highlighting co-benefits so that we can really see the many things that can be affected and how it affects people's daily lives. I'm blanking now. There was another one that crossed my mind a second ago in terms of challenges. Yeah, I'm sorry.
So it's the last part.
Okay.
So just ask your questions.
Okay, gotcha. Thank
That's fine.
you.
You can keep going.
Okay, sure.
Okay, let's skip over challenges for a minute and talk about. This says, talk about recommendations or suggestions that states, MPOs, stakeholders should consider as they work through incorporating greenhouse gas emissions into the process.
Okay, so one of the challenges I've heard in talking to other states and other jurisdictions is how can transportation really reduce emissions and change? A lot of it is not necessarily what we build, but how people use the transportation system. So how do we change that paradigm? And so I think we really need to be considering states, MPOs, other jurisdictions, how the investments that we make affect how people travel. So making that connection between those end users and will emissions increase or decrease as a result. So that's something certainly to pay attention to in all of this. The other key piece is that we can't and shouldn't do it alone. Partnerships are absolutely essential to making effective climate policy and action. In Oregon, we work very closely with our Department of Energy, our Department of Environmental Quality, and our land use agency. And through an official memorandum of understanding, we've created some accountability on hard actions that each agency is going to take to implement our climate reduction policy. And so we have some agencies that have, our land use agency, for example, just put in place some strict land use and transportation planning requirements for local jurisdictions. So that when those jurisdictions plan, they have to demonstrate that they're reducing emissions, and their project list has to result in a reduction of vehicle miles traveled. So there's some pretty strict things that through partnership between the DOT and our land use agency that we put in place. And then working with our Department of Environmental Quality, we in the Department of Transportation are putting in the charging infrastructure, but our Environmental Quality Department is providing incentives for the purchase of electric vehicles. So they're driving down the cost while we're bringing up the infrastructure. And they're also putting in some key regulations that are driving the market. They adopted California's Advanced Clean Cars 2, which requires that all cars sold be electric by 2035. And so all these agencies working together can have a much greater cumulative impact and be effective than if we work alone. So I think DOTs, MPOs, other state agencies find ways to collaborate, to find shared actions and create some accountability at the highest level.
Are you excited about being part of EDC and why?
Well, Every Day Counts is just a great initiative, really helping departments of transportation, our metropolitan planning partners to really think about how we push things. And the great thing about those programs is to learn from one another and to implement those best practices.
Just keep going if you want to.
Okay. You're so good.
Yeah, you are. This is really good.
Thank you.
Gosh, so glad we. What else? I mean, I usually when I interview a team, it's what are the benefits? Well, your benefits are kind of. So I hate to ask. I mean, everybody knows what the benefits of reducing. One thing I've noticed is, and you kind of highlighted it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to some people this week where they said that, reducing emissions and being more sustainable was like a byproduct of, we're also going to save money, or, it also happens to be more durable, but, we also get this. So I think people are, I forgot you said it earlier, somehow it was like.
The co-benefit piece?
Yes, co-benefit, I like that term. Co-benefit, talk about partnerships, that was good.
But I think the opportunity of changing the way that we all do business to make meaningful progress is by truly integrating consideration of climate into everything we do. And therefore, it's not an afterthought. So there are co-benefits of climate action, but those you need to drive towards your emission reduction goals at the forethought, not as an afterthought. And that's the only way we're going to make meaningful progress on things. So one of the other things that we've done as a Department of Transportation is start looking at our federal investments, our Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, And within that, we've started to say, if you put more money into biking, walking, or fixing the transportation system, or public transportation, or safety, what are the impacts on emissions? And that way, we've worked with our commission, who allocates those funds, to set more funding aside, about $100 million more, for climate-friendly actions by showing what the impacts of different investments are and what the trade-offs are.